In a hypothetical war between China and the United States, there's no question that both countries' air forces would play a massive role. Establishing aerial dominance is key to winning conflicts in the modern age, and that's demonstrated in the Ukraine war, in which Russia has failed to maintain a strong aerial presence over Ukraine. That's forced it to take a ground-based approach, which has arguably led to the war becoming far more protracted than it otherwise would have been. With aerial superiority, which Russia should have achieved through sheer numbers alone, its ground forces would have much better support as they try to take Ukrainian territory. Neither China nor the US would want to make the same mistake. So, in a battle between the two nations' air forces, who would come out on top? Let's start by taking a look at some numbers. For that, we turn to Global Firepower, or GFP, and its Power Index scoring system. Each year, GFP takes the top military nations in the world and compares them across a range of categories, including manpower, land power, naval power, resources, logistics, and the star of this video, air power. According to its ratings, the United States leads the pack with the world's strongest military. China isn't far behind though. It came in third in the 2024 rankings, but it's clear that the US has a slight advantage from the offset. Homing in on the two countries' air forces, the United States is a long way ahead of China. GFP says that the US has 13,209 aircraft compared to China's 3,304, meaning it has around 4 times the equipment. The numbers get a little bit closer when comparing fighter jets, with China having 1,207 versus America's 1,854. That gives us some insight into China's approach to an aerial war, as over a third of its fleet is fighter jets. Still, no matter how you look at it, the US comes out on top in sheer numbers. It has 525 more dedicated attack craft and 668 more transports. The latter would prove crucial in a war, as they provide the United States with a greater capacity to send troops into China. The United States also has more trainer aircraft, coming in with 2,648 versus China's 402. Again, this highlights a key difference between the American and Chinese approaches to their air forces, one that would play a key role in a war, and that we'll revisit later. The US also has 606 aerial tanks, aircraft dedicated to aerial refueling of other planes versus China's 10. And on the helicopter front, the United States has 5,737 regular choppers and 1,000 attack helicopters versus China's 913 and 281, respectively. Already, it's pretty clear to see that the United States has the advantage in terms of pure numbers. It has more of everything. Crucially, these numbers offer some insight into the strategies the two countries would employ in an aerial battle. China clearly favors fighters, likely because these aircraft can serve multiple roles, ranging from air-to-air and air-to-ship battles to running missile and bombing campaigns on land-based targets. The US still exceeds China's asset numbers in this area, and it's clear that both believe that any conflict in which they engage would have a heavy naval element. The right fighters can be key to victory in a naval battle, as they can support destroyers and similarly large ships while doing a lot of damage themselves. Beyond that, though, we see the US has far more transports than China, which gives it a greater capacity to send troops into a territory. That would serve the US well if it needed to invade China as part of a war, in which it would be aided by its 11 aircraft carriers and the many overseas military bases it maintains. Speaking of strategy, let's dig a little deeper into that area, starting by looking at the Pacific Air Forces or PACAF's Strategy 2023 document. In it, the PACAF highlights the aerial strategy it believes China would take if conflict were to arise in the Indo-Pacific region. The PACAF notes that China has focused on developing an anti-access strategy combined with aerial denial capability, with its intention being to prevent US forces from entering the Indo-Pacific if China decides to launch an attack. Key here is that this strategy doesn't focus on China attacking the United States. Rather, China aims to keep the US at bay so that it can focus its attack on territories that it wants to take, such as Taiwan. With that in mind, the PACAF claims China's approach to an aerial war would be to focus its attack on U.S. air bases in the Indo-Pacific. Missile barrages launched from Chinese military bases, naval vessels, and aircraft would aim to destroy these bases to limit the U.S. response. And the PACAF has several of those bases. According to the numbers put out directly by the Andersen Air Force Base, PACAF has 45,000 civilian and military personnel serving in 9 military bases in the Indo-Pacific, along with several smaller facilities. These bases include several in Hawaii and Alaska, neither of which is likely to be targeted by a Chinese attack due to their distance from Beijing, as well as bases in Japan, South Korea, and Guam. Combined, these bases host about 340 attack and fighter aircraft, with an additional stock of 100 deployed aircraft that are in constant rotation between the various locations. These craft include 3 of America's 7 F-22 fighter squadrons, along with both of the C-17 transport units that are active outside the United States. These bases would be China's first targets in almost any war it starts, be that one with the United States or a war with a country that the U.S. wishes to protect. To counter Chinese missile barrages, the PACAF says, the U.S. Air Force has developed an agile combat strategy that's designed to complicate targeting for Chinese military planes. This strategy includes diversification of base defenses to include additional camouflage concealment and deception, infrastructure hardening, and active defense capabilities. Non-kinetic solutions are also high on the PACAF's agenda, with investments being made into electronic warfare, lasers, and high-powered microwaves intended to disrupt Chinese targeting in the event of conflict. Aircraft shelters are also a priority, with PACAF likely hoping that these shelters would protect its craft and people from Chinese missiles. PACAF's document also highlights the crucial role that America's allies would play during an Indo-Pacific conflict. Japan, Australia, Singapore, and South Korea are all mentioned as nations that would enhance the PACAF's maintenance and refueling capabilities, with the PACAF also noting that agreements are in place with all 4 countries. It's also worth noting that these countries collectively host 201 of America's 750 overseas military bases. So we start to see the approaches China and the United States would take to the aerial aspect of a conflict. For China, it's all about deterrence and securing the Indo-Pacific as quickly as possible. Its initial strategy would likely be to launch missile barrages at as many American bases as possible, with Guam, Japan, and South Korea being the most likely targets. Its goal would be to cripple America's ability to respond quickly by not only taking out as many of the 340 fighter and attack aircraft that the PACAF has stationed in its overseas bases, but also destroying any bases that are capable of offering maintenance and refueling capabilities to any aircraft that survive. By contrast, the immediate U.S. strategy would focus on defense. PACAF's investments in camouflage, deception, and shelter technology aim to protect as many of its aircraft and people from the initial Chinese missile barrage. From there, PACAF would mobilize and, working together with the U.S. Navy, counterattack against China's aggressive approach. Of course, a Chinese attack would also trigger the launch of more vessels and aircraft into the Indo-Pacific. This is where America's overseas allies would really come into play. America's goal would be to essentially pin the Chinese Air Force into a battle within the Indo-Pacific, likely centered around the South China Sea. It would combine the U.S. Air Force with the U.S. Navy to slowly push China back into its own territory while barricading itself off from Chinese attack by creating a combined aerial and naval border. Japan, South Korea, and Australia would play key roles here. Not only would the American bases installed in these countries essentially serve as conduits through which the U.S. could transport equipment and troops, but they would be key points in the barricade that the United States forms around China. After all, each is at threat if China starts trying to take territory in the Indo-Pacific, which is why they have cooperative military agreements in place with the United States in the first place. Which country would come out on top during the early weeks and months of a battle would depend on how well the PACAF's defenses against China's missile barrages hold up. Assuming the PAC-F manages to keep a large portion of its bases operational, China would face another problem. It's a long way behind the curve when it comes to what the military review calls joint warfare. The People's Liberation Army Air Force, or PLAAF, has undergone rapid development that has often undermined its tactical capabilities. Military Review notes this when discussing what it calls the second period of the PLAAF's development, which lasted between 1956 and 1990. Prior to this period, China built a military with 60,000 soldiers and 800 pilots, focusing on volume ahead of strategy within the PLAAF. The second period saw China being heavily impacted by a cultural revolution, which saw many of the key players in the PLAAF purged from their positions due to suspicions relating to their political reliability. Essentially, the PLAAF was put on pause, at least in terms of developing its tactical nous. By contrast, the second period saw the U.S. Air Force gain invaluable combat experience during the Vietnam War, upon which it refined its tactics and developed the groundwork for the joint warfare capabilities it would exhibit during the Gulf War. For the U.S., the Air Force no longer played a supporting role. It would become an active player in combined military operations, working alongside the Navy and ground forces in operations. China's approach still saw the PLAAF serve a supporting role while grappling with a loss of leadership during the purges. Fast forward to the Gulf War, and China starts to see the U.S. Air Forces and overall American militaries focus on joint warfare in action. The U.S. Air Force essentially integrated with its Navy and ground forces to play a key role in the coalition victory. This was demonstrated during the first days of Operation Desert Storm. On January 17, 1991, U.S. Navy ships stationed in the Red Sea and Persian Gulf launched Tomahawk cruise missiles at Baghdad. That action triggered an entire night of U.S. Air Force attacks. Fixed-wing aircraft combined with attack helicopters launched precision strikes against military installations and communications equipment in Baghdad. The F-117 was one of the stars of the show. Its Tomahawk missiles proved so effective that they shut down Baghdad's electrical systems to the point where they knocked out CNN's live feed of that attack. In a single night, the coalition's joint warfare strategy had practically overwhelmed Iraq's aerial defenses and air force. The coalition obtained aerial superiority within the first week of Operation Desert Storm. China, like many other nations, saw this and realized the siloed PLAAF would be no match for America's refined joint warfare tactics. It needed to play catch-up, which would require extensive training in joint operations. This realization triggered what Military Review calls the third period of the PLAAF, in which it sits today, and China still hasn't caught up. There are several examples, with one of the most important being China's lack of focus on in-flight air refueling. If you remember GFP's figures from earlier, you may recall that the US has 606 aerial tanks compared to just 10 for China. That demonstrates China's lack of understanding of the role that in-flight refueling plays in supporting its air force. It also partially explains why China has been building artificial island chains within the South China Sea. In addition to Beijing's efforts to use its artificial islands to exert its control over this vital waterway, these islands serve as military bases that not only host aircraft but provide landing points from which they can refuel. China believes it can use these islands to extend the range of its aircraft without investing in aerial refueling technology to serve the same purpose. But the United States doesn't agree on that point. That's not to say the US doesn't see value in maintaining bases from which it can launch attacks and handle refueling. The many it has established in the Indo-Pacific demonstrate that. But with its heavy investment into aerial tanks, the US Air Force extends its capabilities both in terms of how long its planes can stay in the air and how far they can travel before they need to land. In simple terms, America's planes can stay in the air longer and conduct more complex joint operations because they can be refueled in the skies. China's planes need to land at military bases to refuel, perhaps even making them targets for American missile barrages coordinated by the U.S. Navy and U.S. Air Force. Joint warfare in action. Through this strategic analysis, we begin to see how China and America's aerial approaches would differ if they were to fight one another. For China, the evolution away from using the PLA-AF in a supporting role has been slow and is arguably incomplete. We see this in its lack of aerial tanks, with Beijing instead focusing on building bases on artificial islands to enable its planes to cover a large portion of the Indo-Pacific. That demonstrates the intention to use the PLA-AF as both a defensive force and for regional attacks. China's scope doesn't appear to stretch much beyond that. The U.S. enhances its regional presence through its military bases in Japan, South Korea, Australia, and Guam, enabling it to create a naval barricade that keeps China within the South and East China Seas. However, that naval approach extends into far more advanced joint warfare tactics. The U.S. would use its Navy to not only conduct missile strikes, as seen on the first day of Operation Desert Storm, but also to support the U.S. Air Force as it engages in precision strikes on Chinese territory. Beijing's artificial islands would be obvious first targets, limiting the PLA-AF's range in the process. It's also notable that the U.S. has 11 aircraft carriers, further extending its reach into the Indo-Pacific, as well as many aerial tanks to enable in-flight refueling. Add in America's large number of aerial assets into the mix, and you have the makings of a quick-hitting strategy in which the U.S. coordinates its attacks across multiple branches of its military to quickly devastate China. The U.S. Air Force isn't solely a supporting arm of America's military. It's fully integrated, meaning it's fluid enough to switch between support and attack as needed while working jointly with the other arms on coordinated regional attacks. That refined strategy would give the United States the edge over China in an aerial battle and, as it was in Operation Desert Storm, would likely be the key to an American victory. So, at this point, we can see that the U.S. Air Force trumps the PLA-AF in two departments. For all of the modernization the PLA-AF has undergone, it's still vastly underpowered when compared to the U.S. Air Force in terms of sheer number of assets. The U.S. has around 4 times the number of aircraft, making it capable of essentially clogging up the skies and overwhelm China's aerial combatants. Combine that with far more refined joint warfare strategies which would make heavy use of the US Navy, America's overseas bases, and its in-flight refueling capabilities, and you get planes that stay in the air longer and conduct more complex operations. China, it seems, is lagging behind, and that trend only continues when you look at equipment. In January of 2011, the maiden flight of the Chengdu J-20 multi-role stealth fighter took place. The aircraft, which is China's first fifth-generation fighter and only the third to ever be created, entered into service at some point between 2018 and 2020, though Beijing has still only built 2 prototype versions of the plane. Nevertheless, it's an impressive piece of kit. It has a blended fuselage and a low radar cross-section. The prototype's engine, the Saturn 117S, is supplied by Russia and is capable of generating 32,000 pounds of thrust. However, China is likely to replace this engine in the production model with a pair of WS-10G turbofan engines that generate 30,000 pounds of thrust and are made in Shenyang. Regardless, these engines give the J-20 a top speed of 1,304 miles an hour, which is just shy of Mach 2. It also has a service ceiling of 59,055 feet and a range of around 2,100 miles. It's an extremely impressive multi-role stealth fighter. The J-20 also stacks up fairly well with its US Air Force equivalent, the F-35. Although the F-35 has better stealth capabilities than the J-20 owing to its smaller size and lower radar cross-section, the J-20 comes out on top in terms of speed and its ability to disrupt supporting aircraft. The J-20 also has supercruise. This feature allows it to fly at high speeds without engaging its afterburners. The F-35 doesn't have that, meaning that its use of afterburners could give its position away in situations where the J-20 would be able to stay hidden. However, the J-20 has disadvantages of its own, with the main one being the lack of a cannon. The national interest suggests that this means that China doesn't anticipate using the jet in a dogfighting capacity, with its likely role being to conduct bombing runs and missile assaults before using its speed to rapidly exit a conflict zone. Regardless, these quibbles about which is the better jet are far less important than what the J-20 represents to China. It's Beijing's step into the fifth-generation fighter space, and it's supposed to show that China's aerial assets are reaching parity with those the United States can deploy. But there are two big problems with that representation. The first is that as impressive as the J-20 may be, it still doesn't appear to be in active production. There are only 2 of these jets in service, with both being prototype models. China is still tinkering away at the jet, which means it may be several years before we see it become a key part of the PLAAF. The US doesn't have that problem with the F-35. It already has 630 F-35s and it plans to purchase 1,800 more. China is being forced to play catch-up again. Even if the J-20 proves to be the superior multi-role fighter, which is already debatable, China's production of this jet is so far behind the US and its F-35 that the point's almost rendered moot. But that's not even the biggest issue that the PLAAF faces with the J-20. While Beijing is trying to get its 5th-generation fighter off the ground, the United States is already working on the 6th generation. In 2014, the US initiated the Next Generation Air Dominance Program, or NGAD. Planned to enter service in 2030, NGAD is a highly classified program. Though we do know that it represents the United States shifting away from the concept of a singular aerial platform to one that involves multiple systems working in tandem. Think of it as an extension of the joint warfare concept, only isolated to a specific collection of aircraft. And collection is the appropriate word here. The US Air Force demonstrated the NGAD program in September of 2020 with a full-scale flight, which showed that the approach combined a manned 6th-generation fighter jet and an array of collaborative combat aircraft, or CCAs. These are unmanned supporting aircraft, essentially more complex drones, that form a network with the manned jet, allowing a pilot to not only use the jet they're piloting, but also to control CCAs in real time as the situation requires. Each NGAD fighter is anticipated to cost $300 million, with that high cost being part of the reason the US Air Force intends to deploy CCAs. They'll give it the option of lowering risk by having fewer pilots in the air, while still maintaining a threat because each pilot commands multiple assets. The CCAs are expected to carry advanced sensors, as well as be equipped with electronic warfare packages designed to disrupt any aircraft the fighter engages. They'll also be stocked with munitions, ideal for supporting the main fighter in aerial engagements. And there's more on top of that. In the spirit of America's joint warfare tactics, the US Air Force and US Navy have announced that they'll be collaborating on what they call the 4 fundamentals of CCA drones. That announcement came in September of 2023, with the goal being to ensure that all CCAs, regardless of which arm of the US military produces them, will be interoperable, meaning they're capable of performing alongside multiple weapon systems. To ensure that, the US Air Force and US Navy want every CCA to have common communication links, aircraft architecture, ground control segments, and autonomy architecture. Brigadier General Dale White, who's the Program Executive Officer for Fighters and Advanced Aircraft in the US military, explains, "We do have those 4 focus areas that allow us to leverage the interoperability that we think we need for a CCA. Because this is not just a single service solution, and we know that going in." Ultimately, the goal of this collaboration is to ensure that the CCAs being developed as part of NGAD aren't only compatible with America's 6th-generation fighter, They should also work along the latest FA-20 fighters, as well as ideally being compatible with the existing aircraft in the U.S. military's fleet. So what exactly does all of this have to do with the U.S. Air Force being capable of beating China? Well, for one, it once again shows how different the U.S. approach is. China is not only playing catch-up on the joint warfare front, but it's also lagging behind when it comes to equipment. As it works toward getting its 5th-generation J-20 in the air, the United States is already deep into the development of a program that will not only lead to the launch of its first 6th-generation fighter, but will enable it to support that fighter with CCAs to essentially create a joint warfare capability controlled by a single pilot. The collaboration between the U.S. Air Force and the U.S. Navy on this project also cannot be underestimated. It shows that both military branches understand that they'll be using the NGAD in tandem during operations. Worse yet for Beijing, there are even more examples of how the PLAAF doesn't measure up to the U.S. Air Force. Take pilot training as another example. The U.S. has clear criteria in place when it comes to choosing and training its pilots. Anybody who applies must be educated to at least the bachelor's degree level and must pass a single-scope background investigation. The applicant must also be between the ages of 18 and 33 when they apply, with height restrictions also in place depending on the type of aircraft the prospective pilot wishes to fly. Assuming the applicant meets the criteria, they're placed into an officer training program, such as Officer Training School or the Air Force Academy, where they complete an 8.5-week program. Next comes about a year spent in undergraduate pilot training, or UPT, toward the end of which the prospective pilot is assigned to an aircraft. After completing UPT, the pilot then spends up to a year continuing their flight training in their assigned aircraft, with the exact time taken varying depending on the aircraft and the pilot's capabilities. And only then does the pilot get assigned to a squadron and location. All told, this amounts to more than 5 years of training, including the completion of a relevant bachelor's degree, demonstrating just how seriously the U.S. Air Force takes its pilot training. They'll then have to meet NATO's requirement of flying at least 15 hours per month, adding up to 180 hours per year, which you could consider as a continuation of the pilot's training. China's approach isn't as clear. That's partially because, as is the case with much of the country's military, the PLAAF doesn't make its training criteria publicly known. However, we know that they lag behind the US. As the Eurasian Times pointed out in a 2022 article, the PLAAF lost around 2,000 of its pilots between 1960 and 2020, with at least 30 of those being test pilots. It's also engaging in a strategy in which it's hiring Western pilots to train its recruits, which mirrors its copying of American training procedures. Again, China is playing catch-up by relying on what already exists to form the basis of its training program. But China is accelerating those programs, or at least trying to. In July of 2022, Le Monde reported on the first PLAAF cadets trained in the J-10, a Chinese fighter bomber who had earned their wings in 3 years instead of the previous standard of 6 years. This may not be the positive news that the PLAAF wants to claim it to be. While it claims that the proportion of tactical training such as multi-aircraft combat and live-fire operations has been increased during this 3-year program, the fact that China is speeding up at all suggests that it's trying to get more pilots in planes quicker than it previously had. Could this be a sign of desperation? Perhaps, though it is also telling that this is far from the first time the PLAAF has changed its pilot training over the last couple of decades. In 2011, for example, it switched from a previous program, which took 10 years to complete, to a 4-phase program taking 6 years. The 2022 Le Monde report shows that, at least when it comes to bomber training, it's since switched to a 3-year program. That inconsistency could cause issues down the line, even if the switches are due to refinement and improvement of its pilot training. In addition, there's also the experience issue to consider. Since 1990, the U.S. Air Force has engaged in multiple wide-scale conflicts, including the Gulf War, the War on Terror, and the war in Iraq. It's also been involved in countless smaller operations, with one of the most recent being its involvement in operations targeting the Houthi insurgents in the Red Sea. As for China, well, the PLAAF hasn't been involved in a single major military operation in the same period. It runs plenty of military drills, but China's pilots have no real combat experience. Combine that with inconsistent training and you get an Air Force staffed with flyers who are likely less capable than their American equivalents. The US has an analytical learning process in place in which it examines its performance in previous conflicts to determine how it can improve in the future. Those lessons form the doctrines, strategies, and procedures all branches of the US military have in place. China doesn't have that approach. Instead, as Air University claims, the PLAAF operates on Mao's theory of the weak contender fighting a stronger adversary through deceit and deception. While fine in theory, transforming that concept into an executable strategy may be beyond the PLAAF's reach. So, where would all of this leave China in a fight against the US Air Force? The answer is that Beijing would be in a bad position, not least because it simply wouldn't ever be fighting the US Air Force alone. America's development of joint warfare tactics during the Gulf War, and its refinement of those tactics ever since, means that China would face combined military operations that involve aerial, naval, and on-ground strategies. This joint warfare expertise would come to bear in a direct conflict, as a fight between the US and Japan would likely center on the South China Sea, East China Sea, and the Taiwan Strait. Combining its naval and aerial prowess with cooperation from the countries hosting American bases in the Indo-Pacific would give the US a major edge over China. Add America's embrace of aerial tanks and in-flight refueling, giving it the territorial coverage advantage, and both China's Navy and its Air Force would likely find themselves fighting a war in which it's increasingly penned in by coordinated American attacks. Add the fact that the US Air Force is 4 times the size of the PLAAF in terms of assets, has better trained and more experienced pilots, and is already working on a 6th generation fighter, while China is still stuck in the 5th generation, and it seems you have a pretty clear victor. But we'd like to hear your thoughts on this matter. Have we at the Map Pack team underestimated the PLAAF's capabilities and China's ability to defend itself within the South China Sea? Or is the US primed to achieve aerial dominance in short order during a conflict, setting the stage for its military to defeat China in a conventional war? Feel free to share your opinions below. Thanks for watching, and take care out there.